The Second World War changed the whole world. Its scale and the atrocities committed by all sides left a permanent mark on many people's lives, and since horror film tends to reflect the fears and hang-ups of the societies and times in which it is produced, the 1950s saw a marked shift in the nature of popular horror. Following the dropping of 2 nuclear bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world entered the atomic age, and the United States alliance with the Soviet Union was no longer necessary, so the US quickly began to distance itself from the perceived threat of communism. The Cold War is extremely complicated, and this video isn't really about that, so let's just make this as simple as possible, shall we? The Soviet Union was attempting to spread communism throughout the world, which the US saw as a massive threat to its newly invigorated capitalist society, so both countries basically used the rest of the world to try to prevent the spreading of each other's ideology. Naturally, Hollywood largely endorsed this stance, and so a lot of horror films from the 50s took a noticeably different approach to the Gothic horror that had dominated the past 2 decades. The villains of this new breed of horror were either the result of tampering with science, which now seemed a lot less benevolent given how it was used to murder millions of people only a few years earlier, or took the form of invaders from outer space as a pointed metaphor for the threat of otherworldly communist agents who would undoubtedly tear down the post-war boom of cars, houses, prosperity, and a great sense of optimism for anyone who was lucky enough to perfectly fit into the extremely rigid definition of what was considered decent at the time, i.e. white, heterosexual, conservative, and male. The film that really kicked off this trend of sci-fi horror was The Thing from Another World, which was later remade by John Carpenter in a more entertaining fashion, but the 50s version isn't bad at all. Its dialogue is fast and snappy, with the military men and scientists stationed in a remote outpost in the Arctic finding a crashed spaceship which they proceed to accidentally blow up. But they do find an alien creature who turns out to be a sentient vegetable, which naturally escapes their custody and begins murdering dogs and then people. Everyone is perhaps a bit too calm about all this. It's one thing to just get on with the horror without all the melodramatic whining that becomes so annoying in films like Dracula, but exchanging Victorian histrionics with characters so cold you'd be forgiven for mistaking them for snowmen doesn't really work either. You see, in order to be invested in a horror film and therefore feel tension and fear, you have to be able to empathize with the characters and understand why they feel threatened. But nobody in this film seems all that worried about the monstrous carrot beast out to murder them all. Everybody is so matter of fact about it that it doesn't seem like much of a problem at all. This is a consistent problem I have with these movies. Our protagonists tend to be scientists and soldiers, but they're all so level-headed that nothing really seems all that dangerous, which pretty much destroys any sense of atmosphere that could be built up by insane monsters smashing the carefully cultivated world apart. The film also began a trend of ending horror films with these weird on-the-nose messages outright stating the point of the film.
Tell the world. Tell this to everybody wherever they are. Watch the skies.
When man entered the atomic age, he opened a door into a new world. What we'll eventually find in that new world, nobody can predict.
All this vast majesty of creation, it had to mean something. And then I meant something too. Yes, smaller than the smallest. I meant something too. To God, there is no zero. I still exist.
Subtle. One film that actually makes a bit more of an effort to have an alien invasion feel like a real problem is The War of the Worlds, which, while it can be annoyingly ham-fisted with its attempts to force religious belief into a story that was originally very critical of the posturing of priests in times of crisis, is actually rather intense a lot of the time. The alien machines, although quite different from the tripods of the novel, are actually kind of creepy, with their long necks and quiet gliding around until they come across a person who they promptly incinerate. It's nice to see a horror film that doesn't shy away from people dying, and the film actually feels like it has stakes, as the whole world is beset by these weird machines that seem completely impervious to all human weapons. It does a good job of creating a sense of panic and has some genuinely chilling moments.
Once they begin to move, no more news comes out of that area.
The movie does let itself down towards the end when the creatures all just keel over because of Earth bacteria. It makes sense that they would die from unfamiliar pathogens, but it's not set up at all, and it all happens so quickly that it doesn't really feel earned. Still, this is one of the best examples of how 50s alien invasion movies can work. Sadly, most of the other fare from this period is a lot less interesting. Rather than a global catastrophe or even a claustrophobic race to kill or be killed as in The Thing from Another World, many films of this ilk take place in small towns, usually in the middle of a desert, where the arrival of aliens or sometimes gigantic ants or a big spider doesn't feel like a terrifying new threat to a previously idyllic life, but rather a break in the monotony of people sitting around in offices and laboratories idly talking to each other. But even then, films such as Invaders from Mars, It Came from Outer Space, Them, Tarantula and The Blob don't really have anything interesting to do with their respective monsters. Weirdly, a spider is less creepy when it's the size of a pylon, and aliens aren't very scary when they look like men dressed in bad Halloween costumes, and many of these films come off as either amusingly bad or just downright boring. That's not to say that there are no good films from this period though. Special effects legend Ray Harryhausen made some great giant monsters with a complicated blend of stop motion and matting shots on top of each other to create what he called dynamation in films such as The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms and It Came from Beneath the Sea. In Japan, Godzilla followed a similar formula but with a lot more thematic weight behind it given the recent devastation of the country, which provides an interesting counterbalance to the America-centric view of the world offered by many of these films. There's even some early body horror in The Quatermass Experiment from the British Hammer Studios, who would go on to great success adapting Gothic horror novels like Universal had in the 1930s. But there is one film that stands head and shoulders above the rest of these 50s sci-fi infused horrors. The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, in which people seem to think that their relatives and friends have been replaced. Initially skeptical, our protagonist Dr. Miles Bennell eventually finds an exact duplicate of his friend Jack, but it soon disappears. Realizing that people are being replaced with replicas from giant seed pods while they are sleeping, Bennell is confronted by these pod people after they have taken over the whole town, and they reveal that they want to simplify life by removing all emotions and individuality. Bennell flees and the quiet invasion grows bigger and bigger, seemingly unstoppable, as people who were once his friends begin to slowly turn on him. I love this movie because it's disturbingly simple. There are no giant monsters or stupid looking aliens, just a slowly building paranoia that nobody can be trusted and that the whole world is gradually turning against you. There's debate as to whether the film is an indictment of communist invaders or, as I prefer to think of it, a warning against mindlessly following a mob mentality. Confusingly, it could be said to argue against the communist threat of the 50s or the threat of the hysterical reaction to the supposed communist threat, with the witch hunts led by Senator Joseph McCarthy of anyone who may not share the conservative ideology of the time being blacklisted from Hollywood, losing their jobs and being ostracized from society and sometimes even thrown in jail. The film suffers from the all too common studio meddling though. They insisted on adding a frame story that ends with Bennell's account being accepted by the authorities and a promising counterattack on the alien invaders. I hate this ending because it completely robs the film of the carefully built up creeping dread that sustained the whole thing and turns what could have been a quietly subversive film into another gung-ho kind of affair. But there is a light at the end of the tunnel. The Hollywood studio system was crumbling due to the rise of television and the movie studios being forced to give up their cinema chains. As such, they had to try harder to get people into seats, and a decade of massive societal upheaval was on the horizon. With the 1960s came the beginnings of horror as we know it today, and it all begins with a film you might have heard of: Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho.